The records that survived are scattered, incomplete, and stained by the secrecy of an era when silence was valued more than truth. What you are about to hear was never meant for public knowledge. During the Second World War, countless operations were planned, executed, and logged into official history. But there were others, buried so deeply that even their existence was denied by the governments who carried them out. These were not glorious campaigns celebrated in post-war speeches. They were acts of desperation, experiments in cruelty, and operations so disturbing that their traces were deliberately erased from the archives. What remains are fragments, partially burned files retrieved from forgotten basements, intercepted cables coded in languages half deciphered, and testimonies whispered decades later by men who feared prosecution more than death itself. Tonight, we unlock those forbidden files under the shadowed heading. 5 disturbed WWII operations that vanished from all official records. The details are raw, fragmented, and deeply unsettling. The story begins on the frozen Eastern Front, where entire battalions disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only silence and suspicion. Chapter 1: The Erased Siege of Narva Heights. In the winter of 1944, as the Eastern Front convulsed under the fury of the Red Army's advance, a small Baltic stronghold became the setting for one of the most chilling erasures of the Second World War. The city of Narva, strategically positioned on Estonia's border with Russia, was defended by German Army Group North and its auxiliaries, including Waffen-SS divisions and local Estonian volunteers. Official histories describe the battles as a brutal yet conventional defense against Soviet forces seeking to reclaim Baltic territory. Yet buried within fragmented Soviet and German records lies an unspoken story, one almost entirely absent from post-war accounts. The battle for the Narva Heights did not end with artillery, rifles, or tanks. It ended in silence, an unnatural silence that witnesses later hinted was caused not by explosives, but by invisible clouds of terror. The surviving fragments point to a stockpile of chemical agents, hastily moved from depots in Silesia and occupied Poland. Among them was tabun, a nerve agent developed by German chemists in 1936, part of a family of weapons so advanced and so feared that Hitler himself had ordered them hidden even from his closest generals. In theory, these weapons were never deployed on the battlefield. Yet in February 1944, under extreme pressure from the Soviet push, reports suggest that a clandestine SS unit known as Einsatzgruppe Höllenfeuer, or Hellfire Detachment, was authorized to release limited quantities in the Narva Heights sector. Soviet divisional logs from the Second Shock Army describe entire battalions collapsing in minutes, men screaming of blindness and convulsions. With no artillery fire to explain the sudden carnage, German records are even more suspicious. War diaries from the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS mention special measures undertaken at Narva, followed by deliberate omissions in casualty lists. In several instances, daily logs jump abruptly, as if entire sections had been torn out and rewritten under orders. Years later, fragments of an OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, directive surfaced, marked Geheime Reichssache, top secret of the Reich, ordering all references to Sonderstoffe, or special substances, to be destroyed immediately. The timing aligns exactly with the Narva Heights engagement. But the Soviet side tells a darker tale. Survivors of the 30th Guards Rifle Corps, interviewed under NKVD supervision after the battle, spoke of comrades dropping mid-charge, foam at their mouths, lungs seizing in spasms. Official Soviet records dismissed these claims as cowardice or exaggeration under stress. Yet in 1946, a classified NKVD memorandum, later leaked during the collapse of the Soviet Union, confirmed suspicions of chemical use, noting that battlefield inspectors found soil samples containing traces of organophosphates, a compound linked to nerve agents. The memorandum ordered all related evidence destroyed and witnesses silenced, fearing the revelation would undermine Moscow's narrative of triumph through sheer Soviet strength. Why such suppression on both sides? For the Germans, acknowledging chemical use would expose Hitler's broken pledge not to unleash such weapons, a promise made to avoid Allied retaliation. For the Soviets, admitting that thousands of their soldiers had been killed by poison gas would have shattered Stalin's carefully curated image of overwhelming, heroic resistance. By the time the war ended, both powers found silence to be the most useful weapon. Western intelligence services were not blind to these whispers. A 1947 OSS briefing, declassified in the 1990s, references persistent rumors of nerve agent deployment in the Baltic theater, most notably in the Narva sector. The document notes that captured German scientists, including those later brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, denied battlefield use but admitted that emergency deployment plans existed. One scientist, Dr. Gerhard Schrader, the very chemist who had discovered Tabun, was recorded in a private interrogation remarking, "I know what Narva was. I will not say more." The transcript ends abruptly, his response marked with a single word: redacted. Eyewitness accounts from Estonian villagers add another layer of horror. They recall fields littered with bodies of Soviet troops, faces contorted in expressions of agony, yet strangely untouched by shrapnel or bullet wounds. Some described German soldiers wearing primitive protective masks, advancing through areas where the Red Army had collapsed en masse. The villagers were warned under threat of execution never to speak of what they had seen. Many remained silent until after the Soviet collapse, their testimonies surfacing in obscure local newspapers during the early 1990s. The question remains, if Narva Heights was a chemical battlefield, why did both sides conspire to erase it? The answer lies in fragile post-war alliances. In 1945, with Germany defeated, the world's powers faced the monumental task of creating a new order. The exposure of chemical weapons on the Eastern Front would have complicated the Nuremberg trials, forced scrutiny of Allied silence, and raised questions about why Western nations did not retaliate if they suspected such weapons had been used. A joint silence was easier, one that maintained the illusion of control and morality during a war that had already broken every rule of human decency. Decades later, researchers combing through Estonian archives discovered a handful of pages from a destroyed German medical log. The entries are chillingly clinical. Subjects displayed immediate ocular reaction, uncontrollable muscle spasms, and respiratory collapse within minutes. Though the log never explicitly names the location, the date corresponds exactly to the Narva Heights battle. The discovery reignited debates among historians, some arguing that Narva marked the true first use of nerve agents in modern warfare, a reality both sides found too shameful to admit. The silence of Narva Heights endures as one of the darkest shadows of World War II. Not because the battle was bloodier than others, but because its very existence was denied, its victims erased from memory. Entire battalions vanished from Soviet rosters, written off as missing in action. German soldiers who may have participated in the release of chemicals disappeared into obscurity. Some perhaps smuggled into post-war scientific programs in the United States or the Soviet Union. And the fields themselves, long since reclaimed by forest and farmland, hold no markers of what transpired there, only whispers carried by those who refuse to forget. Today, the Narva Heights operation remains absent from official histories. No mention exists in the German Bundesarchive, nor in Soviet wartime chronicles. It survives only in fragments, burned documents, scattered testimonies, and the uneasy recognition that both victors and vanquished had reasons to bury the truth. To acknowledge Narva would mean admitting that the world crossed a forbidden line long before Hiroshima, long before the Cold War's nuclear standoff. It would mean facing the reality that chemical warfare was not restrained by morality, but by convenience and secrecy. And that, perhaps, is why the silence remains. Narva Heights stands as a battlefield erased not by time, but by deliberate choice, an operation scrubbed clean from history, yet echoing still in the hidden corridors of forgotten archives. Chapter 2. Operation Hollow Ashes Classified. In the fog of 1942, when occupied, France was a cauldron of resistance and repression. A covert British mission unfolded that has almost entirely vanished from official records. Operation Hollow Ashes was allegedly sanctioned by the Special Operations Executive, the shadowy branch of British intelligence tasked with setting Europe ablaze through sabotage, infiltration, and propaganda. Unlike celebrated missions such as the destruction of the Norsk hydro-heavy water plant in Norway, Hollow Ashes never entered the record of successful Allied operations. Instead, it lingers only in whispers, references buried in French resistance diaries, fragments of British cables that were later redacted, and testimonies from survivors who described a mission that ended not in triumph, but in betrayal and massacre. The operation was believed to have been staged in central France, near the Vichy-controlled regions around Clermont-Ferrand. The objective was simple in outline: cripple the German rail network feeding panzer divisions moving supplies toward the Eastern Front. Allied commanders feared that unless German logistics were disrupted, the Soviet counteroffensive around Stalingrad might falter. A group of SOE-trained commandos, supported by French Maquis fighters, parachuted into the region under cover of darkness in late October. What followed was not the precise sabotage depicted in recruitment manuals. Instead, entire villages were wiped from maps, their inhabitants executed under the accusation of collaboration, while German reprisals descended with a ferocity that stunned even hardened partisans. Survivors later claimed the SOE team had been compromised from the very start. Some whispered that the unit contained a double agent, possibly placed by the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. Evidence for this surfaced decades later in fragments of an Abwehr memo intercepted by American intelligence after the war, noting British operations penetrated, Maquis betrayed. The authenticity of this memo remains disputed, but its language bears the cryptic hallmarks of German intelligence reports: concise, cold, and disturbingly accurate. Whatever the truth, the villages that harbored the resistance were annihilated. Entire families vanished into unmarked graves, while others were deported eastward, their names never recorded. Official SOE logs for the relevant dates show sudden omissions. Mission codenames are listed up to October 23rd, then abruptly resume in mid-November, with no entry for Hollow Ashes or any similar designation. Historians who studied the archives noticed that page numbers skipped, as though files had been physically removed. When inquiries were made during the 1970s, the British government claimed the documents were destroyed in a routine fire at Baker Street headquarters. Yet one former archivist admitted off the record that Hollow Ashes had been subject to an unusual special withdrawal order, meaning files were deliberately removed and sealed. Under the Official Secrets Act, French testimonies complicate the story further. Maquis fighters who survived the reprisals recalled that British operatives issued conflicting orders. Some villagers were told to evacuate, while others were instructed to shelter in place. One farmer described hearing the sound of explosives at the rail junction near his town, only to discover afterward that the tracks remained intact. Instead, German forces arrived suspiciously quickly, as if forewarned of the sabotage attempt. The result was catastrophic. Local resistance was decimated, and hundreds of civilians executed in reprisals that mirrored, in brutality if not in scale, the later massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane. Why was Hollow Ashes erased so thoroughly? One possibility lies in the fragile wartime alliance between Britain and the Free French. Charles de Gaulle, already embittered by the British tendency to withhold intelligence, could not be confronted with evidence that an SOE mission had triggered such carnage. British officials may have concluded that the best way to preserve Franco-British relations was to bury the failure. Another possibility is that Allied command feared that exposure of a compromised mission would reveal weaknesses in SOE security, undermining the credibility of all clandestine operations across Europe. The Soviets too had their reasons to stay silent. NKVD agents embedded in France monitored Allied operations, and at least one report, uncovered in Moscow after 1991, describes Anglo-sabotage yielding disastrous results, counterproductive to Soviet interest. The memo, however, was never published, and Russian archivists remain tight-lipped on whether fuller documentation exists. This silence aligns with Stalin's broader policy of downplaying Allied missteps while magnifying Soviet sacrifices. Hollow Ashes did not fit the narrative of unity against fascism, and so it was excised. The most haunting traces are the survivors' voices, recorded long after the war. One Maquis veteran recalled in a 1963 interview, "We trusted the English to guide us. They came with radios, with promises of weapons, with codes and passwords. Then overnight, the Germans arrived. They knew our names, our farms, our families. They were waiting. It was not war, it was slaughter." His testimony, like others, was archived in regional libraries but seldom referenced by mainstream historians. In the Cold War era, rumors of Hollow Ashes re-emerged when French journalists investigating Nazi collaborators uncovered German field reports from the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, the SS intelligence service. These reports mention enemy agents neutralized in Massif Central, villages disciplined. The wording is chillingly bureaucratic. The dates correspond precisely to the period of Hollow Ashes. Yet once again, The trail ends with missing files, whole folders marked with handwritten notes stating "removed, 1946." Who removed them and why remains unanswered. Some historians have speculated that hollow ashes may not have been solely about rail sabotage. They point to unusual references in SOE training manuals to secondary objectives, involving the identification of suspected Vichy collaborators within the French resistance. If true, hollow ashes may have been a dual mission: sabotage on the surface, counterintelligence beneath. This possibility adds a darker dimension: that civilians may have been sacrificed in a gamble to flush out double agents. If such a policy had been revealed publicly, the legitimacy of Britain's wartime intelligence could have been irreparably damaged. By the time peace returned to France, little remained of the villages touched by hollow ashes. Survivors dispersed, scars unspoken, while the physical ruins were rebuilt without plaques or memorials. Unlike Orador, where ruins stand as a stark reminder of Nazi brutality, the sites linked to hollow ashes were quietly erased from memory. It was as if the land itself conspired in the silence, and yet the traces persist. A letter written in 1947 by an SOE officer to his superior, discovered decades later in a private collection, ends with a cryptic line: "The ashes are buried, but they still burn." It is one of the few direct acknowledgements of the mission's existence. No one has ever publicly explained its meaning. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps a warning, or perhaps an admission that the truth had been smothered but not extinguished. Operation Hollow Ashes stands today as a ghost in the wartime record. Unacknowledged, unexplained, but whispered in the margins of history. Its existence reminds us that the Second World War was not only fought in battles recorded in textbooks, but also in shadows, where missions could vanish, entire communities be sacrificed, and accountability deliberately erased. The true story of Hollow Ashes may never be fully uncovered, but the fragments that remain are enough to reveal a sobering truth: that some operations were so disturbing, their legacy was not remembrance but silence. Chapter 3: Forbidden Files of U-Boat Convoy X. In late 1943, when the tide of war was turning against the Third Reich, German naval strategy shifted toward desperate innovation. The Atlantic, once dominated by U-boats, had become a graveyard for the Kriegsmarine. Allied radar, sonar, and air patrols from Newfoundland to the Azores had made submarine operations increasingly suicidal. And yet, during this period of mounting defeats, whispers emerged of a mysterious flotilla, an unmarked U-boat convoy designated in intercepted communications as Convoy X. What set it apart from standard wolf packs was not its tactics, but its destination and its cargo. It was bound not for the familiar hunting grounds of the North Atlantic, but for the distant waters off South America, a route that made little strategic sense unless the convoy carried something of extraordinary value. Bletchley Park's codebreakers stumbled upon the first hints in November 1943, decoding fragments of Enigma transmissions intercepted by Allied listening posts in Iceland and Bermuda. The decrypted messages were sparse, unusual, and filled with deliberate gaps. They referred to special freight and included coordinates that traced an arc from Trondheim, Norway, through the mid-Atlantic, toward an undefined point in the South Atlantic. Analysts at Bletchley were puzzled. The Germans rarely deployed multiple submarines in formation outside Wolfpack operations, and certainly not on a trajectory leading away from critical Allied shipping lanes. The suspicions deepened when Royal Navy patrols reported sightings of U-boats bearing odd insignia, white runes painted over black hulls, escorted not by destroyers, but by long-range Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes flying at the edge of their operational range. Something was different about these boats. OSS files declassified decades later suggest that Convoy X may have been tasked with transporting advanced technology out of Europe before Germany collapsed. Among the suspected cargo, components linked to the Uran project, the German atomic energy program, and prototypes of the V3 supergun, an experimental weapon designed to bombard London from the French coast. Though mainstream historians argue that Germany never came close to producing a functional atomic device, intelligence reports from both Britain and the United States reveal a persistent fear that Nazi scientists were further along than later admitted. Convoy X, some theorized, carried not weapons, but blueprints, materials, and perhaps even personnel, assets that could be reassembled abroad. The trail of Convoy X becomes clearer when cross-referenced with the unexplained sinking of two Allied destroyers in December 1943, HMS Holcomb and HMS Tyndale, both lost within hours of each other off the coast of Algeria. Survivors reported being struck not by conventional torpedoes, but by attacks so precise they suspected a new weapon was being tested. German records attribute the sinkings to standard U-boat patrols. Yet post-war interrogations of captured U-boat captains yield no claims of responsibility. Some researchers argue that Convoy X may have deployed advanced torpedoes, possibly early versions of the acoustic-seeking G7Es, or Zaunkönig, weapons capable of homing in on a ship's propellers with lethal accuracy. If so, these sinkings were not incidental. They were warnings, a demonstration of the convoy's capabilities. The strongest evidence of Convoy X's existence lies in Argentina. In 1945 and 1946, multiple German submarines surrendered in Mar del Plata, long after Germany's official capitulation. The most infamous was U-977, which arrived after a 70-day submerged voyage. Officially, it carried only its crew, but persistent rumors claim it was part of a broader operation funneling Nazi fugitives, gold, and secret technology into South America. Declassified FBI reports confirm that American intelligence closely monitored these landings, suspecting that cargoes of strategic importance had already been unloaded before surrender. Some even speculated that Convoy X's true destination was Patagonia, where scattered settlements of German expatriates had existed since before the war. The Soviet Union, too, tracked Convoy X. A 1948 GRU memorandum, revealed only after the Cold War, mentions German submarines carrying significant materials to South America under foreign supervision. The phrasing is cryptic, but analysts argue it may suggest Soviet suspicion that the United States had intercepted or even captured part of the convoy. The early Cold War atmosphere, marked by Operation Paperclip and the scramble to recruit German scientists, gave ample reason for all parties to conceal whatever was salvaged from Convoy X. If weapons or prototypes were seized, admitting their origin would have raised dangerous questions about post-war exploitation of Nazi technology. Eyewitness testimony adds yet another disturbing layer. Merchant sailors reported encountering submarines in the South Atlantic flying no flags, their crews visible only as dark silhouettes on deck. One Argentine fisherman described watching a steel beast surface near Patagonia, offloading crates under the cover of night. He claimed the men spoke German, but the cargo was taken inland by trucks bearing no military markings. His account was dismissed as hearsay at the time, yet resurfaced decades later when investigators uncovered abandoned concrete bunkers along the Patagonian coast, structures large enough to house submarines, their existence never explained by Argentine authorities. Why, then, has Convoy X been so thoroughly erased from official histories? The answer lies in the convergence of secrecy and self-interest. For the Allies, acknowledging its existence would mean admitting that advanced German technology, possibly nuclear-related, slipped through the blockade of the Atlantic. For Argentina, whose government under Juan Perón maintained sympathetic ties to Nazi Germany, it would mean exposing complicity in harboring fugitives and contraband. For the Soviets, it would mean acknowledging that their rivals may have gained access to materials that accelerated the nuclear arms race. Each power had reasons to remain silent. Silence, after all, preserved legitimacy in a post-war world already cracking under ideological strain. Some researchers argue that Convoy X never existed, dismissing it as a myth born from fragmented intercepts and exaggerated survivor accounts. Yet the weight of circumstantial evidence, the missing records, the unexplained sinkings, the mysterious U-boat landings in Argentina, points to something far more concrete. Even today, naval historians struggle to explain why certain Kriegsmarine logs for late 1943 remain classified, or why British archives contain unexplained gaps for intercepted transmissions in the South Atlantic corridor. The story of Convoy X endures not as a footnote, but as a void, an absence where records should be, a silence where explanations are demanded. If it carried nothing, why was it erased? If it carried something, what was so valuable, so dangerous, that nations across the world agreed to bury the truth? In the end, Convoy X may not be remembered for what it delivered, but for the secrecy that surrounds it. It is a story of forbidden cargo, vanishing submarines, and files deliberately locked away. And like the black waters of the Atlantic that swallowed so many ships, it remains impenetrable, reflecting only shadows of what might have been. Chapter 4: The Suppressed Carnage of Minsk Corridor, Summer 1944. The Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, one of the most devastating offensives of the Second World War. The Red Army surged across Belarus, encircling the German Army Group Center in a campaign so overwhelming that Western historians later called it the destruction of the Wehrmacht's backbone. Soviet propaganda painted it as a heroic victory, the moment when fascist forces were broken beyond repair. Yet buried deep within restricted NKVD archives is evidence of another story, one that transforms triumph into atrocity. It is the story of the Minsk Corridor, a stretch of land where tens of thousands of surrendering German soldiers vanished, their fate erased from both Soviet and Western records. The official Soviet narrative speaks of hundreds of thousands of German troops captured, marched eastward to labor camps, or executed after due process. But fragmentary reports, suppressed until the fall of the Soviet Union, tell of a different reality. In the narrow corridor between Bobruisk and Minsk, entire German divisions laid down their arms in the hope of humane treatment under the rules of war. They expected the Geneva Convention, or at least the semblance of it. Instead, many never reached a camp. NKVD field units, overwhelmed by the logistics of handling tens of thousands of prisoners, implemented what one document chillingly described as liquidation procedures. Soldiers were marched into forest clearings, ordered to dig trenches, and gunned down in mass executions disguised under artillery bombardment. The numbers are staggering. Some estimates suggest that between 30,000 and 50,000 German troops disappeared in the Minsk corridor alone. Official Soviet casualty statistics quietly list them as missing in action, while German records report them as lost during retreat. Only the testimonies of a few survivors provide clarity. One captured Wehrmacht officer, later interrogated by US intelligence in 1946, described how his unit of nearly 2,000 men was divided into groups of 300, marched into woods and never seen again. He escaped only by slipping into the ranks of another column. His account, filed under OSS Report XG-147, remained classified for decades. The Soviet motive was brutal efficiency. Feeding, transporting, and guarding hundreds of thousands of POWs was an impossible task for an army already stretched thin. Stalin's generals knew that delays could slow the momentum of Bagration, a campaign intended to reach Warsaw before the Western Allies could advance further in France. The simplest solution was elimination. To the Soviet leadership, German soldiers were not prisoners of war. They were fascist invaders responsible for atrocities across Belarus. Entire villages had been razed by German anti-partisan operations, their populations deported or executed. In the eyes of Soviet command, mass killings of surrendering Germans were not war crimes, but acts of vengeance and necessity. But vengeance is not the whole story. Classified directives issued by Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, reveal an additional layer: secrecy. In one memo dated July 5, 1944, Beria instructed his subordinates that no record of processing was to be kept for units executed in the field. The wording suggests deliberate erasure, a calculated effort to ensure that these killings would never appear in official Soviet history. To admit them would weaken Moscow's carefully curated image as a liberator of Eastern Europe, not an oppressor. It would also risk diplomatic backlash from Western allies, who publicly adhered to international conventions even while tolerating their own moral compromises. Western silence is equally telling. During the Nuremberg trials, where the crimes of the Nazi regime were laid bare, the fate of German POWs in Soviet hands was conspicuously absent. American prosecutors privately acknowledged the rumors of Soviet mass executions, but dismissed them as politically dangerous. To accuse their ally of war crimes would fracture the fragile unity that had carried them to victory. Justice, in this case, was selective, and silence became the price of geopolitical stability. The physical evidence of the Minsk corridor remained hidden for decades. Locals in Belarus whispered of unmarked graves in the forests, long stretches of land where the soil sank unevenly after heavy rain. Farmers reported finding bone fragments while ploughing fields, only to be warned by Soviet authorities never to speak of their discoveries. During the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, amateur researchers and journalists uncovered several of these sites. In one case, near the village of Cherven, investigators unearthed mass graves containing remains consistent with German military uniforms, yet official acknowledgement never followed. The Belarusian government, wary of reopening wounds, downplayed the findings as ordinary wartime casualties. The testimonies of Soviet veterans complicate the story further. Some confessed late in life to participating in mass shootings. One Red Army sergeant, interviewed anonymously in the early 1990s, recalled, "We were ordered to march them into the woods. They carried no weapons, only what they wore. We dug the ground. They stood in lines. The order was clear, no prisoners. I still hear the shots." His confession was recorded by a local journalist but published only in small underground pamphlets, never in mainstream press. Why does this matter now? Because the Minsk corridor was not an isolated atrocity. It symbolized the brutal pragmatism of total war, where even the victors crossed lines too disturbing to admit. The Soviet Union built its post-war legitimacy on the image of liberation, but the corridor reveals another side, a regime that annihilated enemies not only in battle, but after they had surrendered. For decades, this duality was hidden, protected by censorship, propaganda, and the willingness of the West to look away. In the archives of the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, Germany, there are unexplained gaps in the records of divisions destroyed during Bagration. Entire regiments of the 9th Army vanish from documentation after June 1944. German families searching for missing soldiers after the war were told nothing. Their sons, husbands, and fathers were swallowed by the silence of the Minsk corridor. Even today, Red Cross records list thousands as missing, with no further explanation. What lingers most is the silence, the deliberate erasure of an atrocity too massive to ignore, yet too inconvenient to confront. The Minsk corridor was both a battlefield and a graveyard, a place where history itself was rewritten through suppression. It stands as a reminder that victory in war does not absolve nations of their crimes, and that the line between liberator and oppressor can blur in the fog of secrecy. The suppressed carnage of the Minsk corridor is not taught in classrooms. It does not appear in Soviet war memorials or Allied commemorations. It exists only in fragments, whispers from survivors, uncovered bones, and redacted files. Yet its shadow stretches across history, demanding that we ask the forbidden question: how many of the missing were truly lost in battle, and how many were erased by the victors themselves? Chapter 5: Operation Eclipse Shadows Erased. April 1945. The Reich was collapsing, Berlin was burning, and Allied troops were pushing into the heart of Nazi Germany. As the Soviet army stormed from the east, the British and Americans launched Operation Eclipse, the codename for their plan to occupy German territory, seize key cities, and prevent chaos during the final surrender. Official histories record Eclipse as a straightforward operation: the orderly disarmament of the Wehrmacht, the establishment of military government, and the stabilization of a shattered country. But in the shadows of that documented plan lay an annex, an erased fragment known only through scattered testimonies and heavily redacted intelligence files. It was called Eclipse Shadows, and its objective was not stabilization, but extraction, an effort to seize materials and knowledge hidden deep within the Third Reich before the Soviets could reach them. The operation began in Thuringia, a region in central Germany riddled with underground facilities. Throughout the war, the SS and the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi research institute obsessed with archaeology, the occult, and experimental science, had established secret projects in vast subterranean tunnels dug by forced labor. These complexes, hidden in forests and camouflaged hillsides, were linked to advanced weapons research, including jet propulsion, rocketry, and chemical experimentation. Allied command knew of their existence from intercepted communications and reconnaissance flights. But what Eclipse Shadows sought went beyond conventional weapons. OSS records hint at unorthodox laboratories, chambers where human experimentation and psychological warfare projects were conducted under the SS. When American infantry entered Thuringia in late April, several units were diverted without explanation from their official orders. Soldiers later described stumbling into abandoned facilities, filled with mutilated corpses, strange medical equipment, and crates marked with occult insignia, the double lightning bolts of the SS entwined with runes. One GI, interviewed decades later, recalled, "It wasn't like the camps we'd seen before. This was something else. The bodies looked wrong. The rooms were lined with diagrams we couldn't understand. We were told never to speak of it." His testimony aligns with the fragmentary notes of Eclipse Shadows. A mission that seems to have operated parallel to the broader occupation plan, hidden even from many Allied commanders. Within days, the sites were sealed. Reports were filed only to the highest levels of command. Units that entered the tunnels were reassigned almost immediately, their war diaries redacted. Equipment was confiscated, loaded into unmarked trucks, and transported westward, allegedly toward US bases in Bavaria before being shipped across the Atlantic. By May 1945, nothing remained in the tunnels but concrete rubble, deliberately collapsed to prevent Soviet inspection. The Soviets, arriving weeks later, expressed fury at being denied access. They accused the United States of removing forbidden technologies, possibly related to advanced propulsion or psychological conditioning. Stalin himself complained privately that the Western Allies had seized secrets beyond rockets, an ambiguous phrase that has fueled speculation ever since. What exactly was taken? Declassified American files provide hints but no certainty. A 1946 War Department memo refers to material recovered from Eclipse operations, Category Black, a designation applied to items considered too sensitive, even for scientific review. Another file, redacted almost entirely, mentions cognitive warfare research, suggesting that the facilities contained experiments not only in physical weapons, but in the manipulation of the human mind. The Narva had been known for bizarre projects, ranging from racial anthropology to experiments with sensory deprivation and drug-induced states. Eclipse shadows may have uncovered the remnants of these programs, including research deemed too disturbing for public knowledge. Eyewitness reports from German civilians reinforce this interpretation. Residents near Ohrdruf and Jonestal described truck convoys moving through the night, guarded by American soldiers with orders to shoot trespassers. Some claimed to see crates stenciled with English letters loaded onto aircraft at captured airfields. Others reported hearing explosions as tunnels were sealed, their entrances buried beneath tons of rock. These stories were dismissed as rumor in the post-war years, but they align with military records showing unexplained demolitions carried out by US engineering units. Why was Eclipse shadows erased? The answer lies in the geopolitical fault lines of the emerging Cold War. By 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union were no longer allies in spirit, but rivals racing to seize the spoils of a defeated Reich. Operation Paperclip, the secret program to recruit German scientists, was already underway. Admitting that Eclipse shadows had secured not only rocket experts like Werner von Braun, but also forbidden experiments in chemical, biological, or psychological warfare would have provoked outrage. The American public, already horrified by Nazi atrocities, might have rejected the use of such knowledge. Even in the name of national security, silence was safer. Files were destroyed, units disbanded, and the operation itself struck from official records, yet traces survived. In 1962, a Senate subcommittee investigating military spending uncovered budget entries for special projects. Eclipse. The documents were quickly withdrawn, but not before journalists noted the connection. In the decades since, researchers have pieced together fragments, interviews with veterans, declassified memos, and unexplained gaps in the official Eclipse files. Some have gone further, speculating that Eclipse shadows recovered not just weapons research, but evidence of experiments so grotesque they blurred the line between science and sadism. The Soviets never forgot. In the early years of the Cold War, Soviet propaganda repeatedly accused the United States of harboring Nazi secrets. Pravda published articles hinting that American advances in jet propulsion and psychological warfare derived from plundered fascist laboratories. Though dismissed in the West as exaggeration, these accusations contained a kernel of truth. Both superpowers, desperate to gain an edge, had plundered Germany's hidden projects. But Eclipse Shadows stands out for the secrecy surrounding it, the deliberate erasure of its very existence. Today, the tunnels of Thuringia remain. Some are sealed, others partially collapsed, and a few have been reopened by explorers who describe endless corridors of concrete, rusted machinery, and graffiti from terrified laborers. The most haunting finds are symbols etched into the walls, runes, swastikas, and cryptic diagrams, suggesting the convergence of pseudoscience, ideology, and cruelty. Whether these remnants connect directly to Eclipse shadows is uncertain, but they reinforce the sense that something was hidden there, something the victors deemed too dangerous to reveal. Operation Eclipse Shadows was not a battle, nor a liberation. It was a theft, a seizure of knowledge so disturbing that it was buried beneath layers of denial. It represents the moment when World War II's horrors transitioned into Cold War secrecy, when atrocities became assets and forbidden science became bargaining chips. Its erasure from history is not accidental. It is deliberate, a silence crafted to protect those who profited from the shadows. And like the tunnels of Thuringia themselves, the truth remains sealed, echoing faintly in the darkness, waiting for light that may never come. The files we have examined are fragments, torn from the vaults of a war that still shapes the present. 5 operations, buried, distorted, or erased, have emerged from the silence of 70 years. Each case shares the same disturbing pattern. Records vanishing, testimonies suppressed, witnesses silenced. The Siege of Narva Heights, Operation Hollow Ashes, Convoy X, the Minsk Corridor, and Eclipse Shadows. Together they form a hidden map of a war fought not only with tanks and artillery, but with deception, experimentation, and calculated erasure. These were not simply lost battles, they were operations deliberately obscured. Their outcomes too dangerous or too shameful to survive in the archives of official memory. And yet, despite every effort to destroy the evidence, shadows remain. Smuggled documents, scattered testimonies, and faint echoes in declassified files remind us that history is never entirely under lock. The war's most disturbing secrets continue to bleed into the present, whispering of crimes and calculations that shaped the Cold War and perhaps even the world we live in today. What else remains sealed, buried deeper than these? The answer lies not in the records we are allowed to see, but in the ones still missing.